Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We're continuing our journey through modern Indian history, which, as you know, is a big deal if you're prepping for the UPSC exam, especially that GS1 paper.
That's right.
It's part 2 of our Modern Indian History series, and this time we're going deep into the Sikh Reform Movements of the 19th and 20th centuries in Punjab.
Lots to untack there.
We're talking about movements that fought for control over Sikh shrines, movements that encouraged followers to carry, well, a bamboo staff instead of a sword.
Some really fascinating stories to uncover.
And of course, this stuff isn't just for exam prep. It's just plain fascinating history. So whether you're in the books or just curious, stick with us.
Definitely.
Before we jump in, though, quick reminder to hit that like button and subscribe to catch all our future deep dives. Now, let's get started.
Sounds good.
To really get this, we need to set the scene in 19th century Punjab.
Right. Imagine Punjab in the 1800s. It's a real mix of religious and social change happening all at once. You've got Hindu reform movements like the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj shaking things up.
Yeah.
Then you have Muslim groups like the Aligarh and Ahmadiyya movements are actively trying to convert people. And of course, you can't forget about the Christian missionaries. They're out there spreading their faith, too. It was a really dynamic time.
Sounds like a lot of competing ideas floating around.
Yeah, a bit turbulent, honestly.
So how did all of this impact the Sikh community? Like, how did they react to this environment?
Well, that's the key, you know? These Sikh reform movements, they didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
They were a direct response to all these challenges, and let's be honest, opportunities that came up during that era. Think about it. The Sikhs were dealing with all these different influences.
Mm-hmm.
And these reform movements were their way of saying, hey, this is who we are, you know, asserting their own identity in this constantly shifting world.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about one of these movements, the Singh Sabha movement. It kicked off in 1873. From what I've read, it seems like their main goal was getting back to the basics of Sikhism, purifying it, and putting a huge emphasis on education.
Exactly. They were really worried about what they saw as people straying from the original teachings of Sikhism.
I see.
They wanted to bring back the purity of the faith, the way the Sikh gurus intended it.
Right.
And education was a huge part of that. They set up schools, published religious texts, and even became big supporters of the Punjabi language.
It's actually pretty amazing that they even tried to get Englishmen involved in their educational programs. What do you think they were hoping to achieve with that?
Well, I think it shows that they wanted to find some common ground with the British, the ones in power, you know, even while they were working hard to solidify their own unique identity.
Interesting.
It was a bit of a balancing act, trying to deal with the reality of British rule while also building up their own community.
Trying to work within the system while still pushing for change.
That's it.
And if I'm remembering right, this movement, it kind of sets the stage for a much bigger fight, right? The fight for Sikhs to have control over their own religious shrines.
You got it. The Singh Sabha movement, while it was focused on internal reforms, it really planted the seeds for a more assertive Sikh community.
Okay.
This led to later movements that directly challenged the way things were, including that fight for control over Gurdwaras.
Got it. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another really interesting movement, the Namdhari movement. They came about even earlier, in 1857.
Right.
They were led by Baba Ram Singh and were known for sticking very closely to the ceremonies established by Guru Gobind Singh. But the thing that really caught my eye was this. They carried a lathi, a bamboo staff, instead of the kirpan.
Yeah,
That seems like a pretty big change.
it is.
Why do you think they made that choice?
Some people think it was a way to avoid direct conflict with the British.
Yeah, makes sense.
You know, after the 1857 uprising, the British were understandably a bit on edge about weapons. So maybe the Lathi was a way for them to show strength and identity without being seen as a direct threat.
Like a clever workaround.
Exactly. And they were also really focused on separating themselves from practices they saw as coming from Hinduism.
Oh, right, like the idol worship and the authority of Brahmin priests.
That's right. They wanted to establish a clear Sikh identity, free from what they saw as outside influences.
Okay, so it sounds like there's this recurring theme here, this drive to define and reclaim Sikh identity in a world that's changing so rapidly.
Definitely.
Now, let's move on to the Nirankari movement. This one started around 1855.
Okay.
Their big focus was the concept of Nirankar, a formless god.
Right.
How did that shape their beliefs and the way they practiced their faith?
Well, the Nirankaris, under the leadership of Baba Dayal Das, believed that emphasizing the formless aspect of God helped them get away from rituals and ceremonies they thought were unnecessary.
Interesting.
They were essentially simplifying their faith, zeroing in on the core beliefs,
I see.
and they were known for issuing hukamnamas.
Oh, right, those official decrees to clarify what practices were acceptable within the movement. What do these hukamnamas tell us about their view on religious authority?
I think they show that the Nirankaris wanted clear guidelines and a unified understanding of Sikh practices within their community. And, this approach may have actually helped them in their interactions with the British.
How so?
While the British often preferred religious groups that were structured and organized.
Okay, that's interesting. And speaking of the British, the Nirankaris decided to cooperate with them.
Right.
Which was different from some of the other movements we've talked about that faced opposition.
Yeah.
How did this cooperation impact their growth?
Good question. Cooperating with the British gave the Nirankaris some protection and support, and that, in turn, allowed them to spread their influence.
Makes sense.
It's a good reminder that these reform movements had to be smart about navigating the power dynamics of the time.
Absolutely. So we've looked at three distinct movements so far. The Singh Sabha, the Namdharis, and the Nirankaris. Each one with its own unique way of approaching reform and navigating the complexities of their time.
Right.
But there's one movement that really shook things up, especially when it comes to political action, and that's the Akali Movement. They gained a lot of momentum between 1920 and 1925. What made them stand out?
The Akali movement is really notable for their fight to take control of the Gurdwaras, the Sikh shrines.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about reforming religious practices. It was about reclaiming the very heart of Sikh religious life,
Right.
which at the time was under the control of Mahants.
And these Mahants, if I'm remembering correctly, they were hereditary priests who often treated the Gurdwaras like their own personal property.
Exactly.
And the Akalis challenged that.
Yes. The Akalis saw this control by the Mahants as a corruption of Sikh principles.
Okay.
And they launched a series of protests and campaigns to try and take back control of the Gurdwaras.
Wow.
And get this, they adopted Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, to achieve their goals.
So they were fighting for more than just physical spaces.
Absolutely.
They were fighting for the soul of their community, their right to govern themselves.
Exactly.
And they did it peacefully, inspired by Gandhi. It's pretty powerful. And their efforts ultimately led to the Sikh Gurdwaras Act being passed in 1925. What impact did this act have?
Well, the Sikh Gurdwaras Act was a huge victory for the Akali movement. It led to the creation of the Shiromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee.
The SGPC.
Yep, a democratically elected body whose job it was to manage the Gurdwaras.
Okay.
This was a major shift in power. The Sikh community now had direct control over their most sacred spaces.
This must have been a huge moment for the Sikh community, really shaping their identity and political awareness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how the Akalis were able to achieve such a big win through peaceful means.
Right.
It really shows the power of people coming together and just refusing to give up. But their success wasn't just about managing property, was it?
No, not at all. The Gurdwaras are way more than just buildings. They're like the heart and soul of the Sikh community.
Right.
Taking back control of those spaces, it was about restoring their spiritual and social center.
Yeah, it was about asserting their right to shape their own religious life, you know.
Exactly.
And this win coming after all those other reform movements we talked about, it must have had a huge impact on how the Sikh community saw themselves, their identity, and their place in Indian society as a whole.
Absolutely. The success of the Akali movement, it really showed how powerful collective action could be, and it gave Sikhs a much stronger political voice. It also showed how effective nonviolent resistance could be, something that would continue to be a major force in the Indian independence movement.
So we've seen how all these Sikh reform movements aim to purify religious practices, take back control of their institutions, and really assert a distinct Sikh identity. But how did these movements fit in with the larger Indian nationalist movement that was happening at the same time? Were they seen as allies, rivals, or somewhere in between?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. Many Sikhs were actively involved in the Indian National Congress and shared the goal of independence from British rule.
Okay.
But at the same time, there were also anxieties within the Sikh community about what their future would look like in an independent India.
Yeah, that makes sense. They had just fought so hard for control over their religious institutions, so they were probably worried about protecting their autonomy in a new political system.
Exactly. There were concerns about potentially being marginalized in a nation that could end up with a Hindu majority.
Right.
This led to a lot of discussions and debates within the Sikh community about what kind of self-governance would be best for them.
Interesting.
Some people advocated for a separate Sikh state,
Wow.
while others thought a federal system within a united India would be a better solution.
It sounds like a time full of both hope and uncertainty.
Yeah, it was. The possibility of independence was exciting, of course, but there were also worries about how the Sikh community would navigate this new reality.
How would they keep their distinct identity while also being part of the larger Indian nation?
You hit the nail on the head. It was a period of massive change and upheaval, and these Sikh reform movements were right at the center of it all.
Yeah.
They reflected the community's struggle to figure out their own path, both religiously and politically.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored what made each movement unique, how they impacted Sikh identity, and their complicated relationship with the Indian nationalist movement.
Right.
But for our listeners who are studying for the UPSC exam, what's the most important thing to take away from all of this? How should they connect these movements to the bigger themes of modern Indian history?
The key takeaway is this. These Sikh reform movements weren't just about religion.
Okay.
They were about a community trying to define who they were, assert their rights, and shape their own future in a world that was changing fast.
Right.
They show how religious, social, and political forces all intertwined to shape modern India.
So when you're studying for the UPSC, don't just try to memorize names and dates.
Right.
It's about understanding what motivated people, what they were hoping for, and the challenges they faced.
Exactly. These movements give us a glimpse into how dynamic and complex modern Indian history really was.
Yeah.
They offer valuable insights into how religious identity evolved, the fight for political power, and the ongoing debate about the best way to structure a diverse society.
And that's a debate that's still going on today, both in India and around the world.
Absolutely. The challenges the Sikh community faced in the 19th and 20th centuries, the need to preserve their identity, navigate power dynamics, and find their place within a larger nation are themes that are relevant everywhere.
It's really interesting how history can give us such valuable insights into issues that are still important today. But I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about for now. As we wrap up our deep dive into these Sikh reform movements, what's one final thought-provoking idea you'd like to leave them with?
How about this? How did these reform movements ultimately shape the distinct identity and political consciousness of Sikhs in the 20th century and beyond?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's a question worth thinking about as you continue exploring modern Indian history. Remember, history isn't just a bunch of facts and figures.
Right.
It's a living conversation that's still shaping how we understand the world. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep learning.
That's a great note to end on. And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to additional resources that can help you dive even deeper into this fascinating topic.
And as you keep digging into the modern history of India, especially for those getting ready for the UPSC exam, it's so important to connect these Sikh reform movements to the bigger picture.
I totally agree. These movements weren't just isolated events. They were really intertwined with everything else going on at the time, the social and political changes. How can our listeners, especially those focusing on the UPSC exam, use this understanding to do well?
Well, understanding the ins and outs of these Sikh reform movements, it can be a real game changer in the UPSC exam. Like, let's say a question pops up about what led to the rise of religious reform movements in 19th century India.
Okay.
You could easily bring in the Sikh experience, highlighting how they reacted to the whole social and political climate back then.
That's such a good point. It's all about showing that you get the connections between historical events.
Exactly.
Instead of just listing facts, our listeners can show off their analytical skills, right?
Right.
By linking these movements to bigger themes like colonialism, nationalism, that search for identity.
Exactly. Like if you talk about how the Akali movement adopted satyagraha, it shows you understand how Gandhi's philosophy influenced different groups and movements. Those connections, that's what makes your answers stand out and impress those examiners.
Makes sense. So to all our listeners out there, especially our dedicated UPSC aspirants and anyone who just finds Indian history fascinating, I hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights, a fresh way of looking at things.
Definitely.
Remember, history isn't just about memorizing dates and events. It's about understanding the forces that shape societies
Yeah.
and the individuals who were brave enough to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
These Sikh reform movements are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the pursuit of identity, the power of people coming together to make change happen. As we wrap up this episode, I encourage all of you to keep exploring these movements, delve deeper into their complexities, and let their stories inspire your own journey of learning and discovery.
Yeah, and who knows?
What?
Maybe someday you'll be writing your own chapter in history.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Happy studying, everyone.